South's devastating loss in the Civil War, the former Confederate states had to reorganize and reform under a process known as Reconstruction. Mississippi was forced to submit to federal authority. Former slaves outnumbered whites by 60,000 in the state. And in Hinds County, the majority was more than 2 to 1. Former slaves flocked to the Republican Party, which won control of the state and county governments in 1870. Republican domination continued until 1875, when legislative and county elections were scheduled. Now, by this time, the federal resolve to ensure equality for emancipated slaves had weakened. When whites in Mississippi moved to regain control of state government, Clinton became the battleground for the struggle to end Reconstruction and eliminate African American representation in Mississippi politics. The Hinds County Democratic Party met in Raymond in August of 1875 to select candidates for the November election. The Democrats also adopted what would be later called the Mississippi Plan, a strategy to justify the elimination of the voices of the African Americans in government by any means necessary. Well, the inevitable bloody result of the Mississippi Plan occurred during a Republican political rally near Clinton on September 4th in 1875. Historians call it the Clinton Riot, and it was followed by the Clinton Massacre. Now, there were many witnesses to what happened in Clinton on that day, 140 years ago. Their personal accounts were reported in local newspapers, in one historical journal, and also a testimony before the U.S. Senate Investigating Commission, the Boutwell Committee. Though the accounts differ, each gives us some understanding of what happened that day. These are
the voices of the Clinton Riot.
George Harper was a zealot for the Democratic cause. He described the Mississippi Plan in the Hinds County Gazette, a weekly newspaper published in Raymond.
There are those who think that the leaders of the Radical Party have carried this system of fraud and falsehood just far enough in Hinds County, and that the time has come when it should be stopped, peacefully, if possible, forcibly, if necessary. Whenever the radical leaders proceed to mislead the Negroes and open with falsehood and deceptions and misrepresentations, the committee should stop them right then and there and compel them to tell the truth. I can tell you, the old hills in this part of Hinds County echoed and re-echoed with the cries and shouts of a people determined to be free, determined to throw off at whatever cost an infamous government and corrupt officials.
Well, after the Democratic meeting in Raymond, State Senator Charles Caldwell, chairman of the Republican Party in Hinds County, organized a political rally in Clinton on September 4th, 1875, to identify Republican candidates for county and legislative offices. Now, Caldwell invited the Democrats to send a representative to the Clinton rally, hoping his gesture of bipartisanship would discourage the rowdier elements of the Democratic Party from interrupting the Republican meeting. Well, the Republican rally was held on the grounds of the old Moss Hill Plantation, and that was just northwest of downtown Clinton. Senator Caldwell specified that no weapons or alcoholic beverages of any kind were to be allowed on the grounds, and recruited a small militia of Republican constables to enforce the rules. Calvin Wells, head of the Hinds County Democratic Party, was at Moss Hill that day. Calvin gave this account.
Judge Johnson spoke for about an hour for the Democrats, and Mr. Fisher for the Republicans had replied for about 15 minutes when the disturbance took place. Now, Caldwell was very near me, and as soon as he saw the disturbance begin, he went hurriedly and placed himself between the belligerents. A few white men on the west side facing east, and an immense horde of Negroes facing them and only a few feet apart. Caldwell had no arms on him as far as I could see, but was going between the belligerents, gesturing with his walking cane on the Negroes and seeming to be counseling with the whites. Hardly had Caldwell extricated himself from between the men when the Negroes pressed on towards the white men in a belligerent and threatening manner. I saw Frank Thompson shoot as rapidly as he could fire his pistol until he emptied it, as did his comrades, I think. And then they were at the mercy of the Negroes.
George Swan gave testimony to the Boutwell Committee.
Judge Johnson's speech was good, temperate, received with patient attention by the audience. Fisher begins to speak. He congratulates the audience at the calm, peaceful character of the meeting and expressed hope that the state of things might continue to the end of the campus. Then I heard a voice to my right.
It would be so if you stopped telling me damn lies. That's what you are. Liar.
I asked Colonel Lake the identity of the person who made the remark, and a man to his left turned on me.
Well, that remark was made by my brother.
If you want to know, his name is Neil.
Yeah, Neil.
Yeah.
Just then another man approached, shaking his hand in an angry way.
And I made it. Have you anything to say to me?
Shortly thereafter, I noticed a general commotion in the crowd and a movement toward the direction of the bottom. Charles Caldwell made a considerable effort to get the crowd to stand still and hear the speaking. He got off the stand with the view to get the crowd to return. I hear the crack of a pistol shot. Then I hear cracks of several more. And then an immense rush in the crowd and shrieks of women. The crowd pushed me along 20 to 30 yards, and then the crowd surged along across the hill. The main firing took place where it commenced, at the bottom.
Benjamin Sterling White was a 38-year-old former Texas Ranger who had settled in Raymond after the Civil War. He and George Harper were both Democrats, but gave differing accounts of what happened that day.
Some of the white boys had been drinking. I went to them and I told them not to touch any more whiskey. I told them it was plain to see that the Negroes mean trouble and would use any pretext to start it. I returned later and saw two of them going off down the hill. And I asked them where they're going.
Well, we got a bottle of whiskey.
Yeah, damn good stuff, too.
Poppycock. There was no bottle of whiskey in the origins of this affair, as has been charged. No Raymond man knows any such thing. The young men charged with having one all deny it.
As soon as Fisher began to speak, the group of Raymond men are surrounded by a crowd of Negroes, headed by Eugene Welborn, Sam Caldwell, and Charles Caldwell, Jr. Fisher had been speaking about 8 minutes when someone in the upper part of the crowd made a remark. I sought out that man. Neil and I told him he must make no remarks in that crowd. Soon I noticed a rush of Negroes to a bottom about 100 yards north of the stand. I tell the Raymond men at the stand to remain. I leave Sibley and Thompson at the stand, and I see a crowd of Negroes pressing on the whites. Caldwell appeared, and he was followed by about 100 Negroes.
Stop this damn fuss here. I'm gonna have it stopped. Now get out of here, you damn rascals. Stop this fuss.
Then I hear a drum beat, and then the firing started. I saw not less than 300 Negroes with pistols in their hands. They seemed to be especially after Martin Sidley and myself.
The affair was brought about like this. At some distance from the speaker's stand, there was an intoxicated young man. He had taken his drinks in Clinton and had none on the ground. A colored man called Senator Caldwell's attention to the intoxicated man, and he, supposing that a row might ensue or that the intoxicated man might interrupt the meeting, proceeded in great haste to the spot where the intoxicated man stood.
Now, according to George Harper, the white men with the intoxicated man assured Caldwell and all the others that came up that they would take care of their companion and would take him from the grounds.
The Negroes, however, were greatly excited as they arrived, and most of them came up with pistols drawn, and soon the shout was raised.
Kill him! Kill him, damn Democrats! Kill him right now!
Things were clearly out of hand. The intoxicated man and his companions, and the half-dozen other whites who came up and joined them, endeavored to pacify the blacks, assuring them that nothing had occurred that should bring on any difficulty, and they would take the intoxicated man away. But the assurances would not do. The blacks were for a fight. So the black crowd assumed tremendous proportions. It commenced pressing on the little party of whites, cursing and swearing bitterly, shaking fists, brandishing clubs and knives and cocked pistols. At that time, not a pistol had been shown by the whites, while deadly weapons glistened all over the crowd of blacks. The drum beat. The firing commenced.
Eugene Wellborn, age 27, a former slave, gave this testimony.
When Captain Fisher came to the stand, I was about 20 feet from him. There were a couple of young men standing in front of me, Sibley and Thompson of Raymond. These gentlemen, we understood, were a committee sent from Raymond. In the event the Republican speakers told anything there that was not so, they had the right to contradict them and make them stop. I went and saw Senator Caldwell and called his attention to these fellows. Thompson had a bottle of whiskey in his hand. He was drinking, and every now and then would say,
Stop your damn lying.
Goodness
That'll be enough of that, young man.
Anyway, Alec Wilson went up to Thompson and said, Mr. Thompson, you must not go that way. He told Thompson he was a peace officer and would have to arrest him if he did not stop. When Wilson said that, about 20 or 30 of the Raymond crowd got together around Thompson. Mr. Thompson told Mr. Wilson that he was going to do whatever he pleased. Then Wilson attempted to arrest him, and instantly Thompson pulled out his pistol and shot him down. Every man in that line pulled out their pistols and began to fire into the crowd.
Charles Caldwell's eyewitness account of the Clinton riot was printed in the weekly Mississippi Pilot, a Republican paper, a week after the riot.
Now here's what happened. Judge Johnson had spoken for about an hour to an audience of over 2,000, all of whom listened very attentively. Captain Fisher then ascended the stand and commenced speaking. In about 5 minutes, someone called him a liar. So I proceeded to the spot and asked, what was the matter? A policeman said,
This man Thompson had drawn a pistol on one of the colored men who was marshaling the procession and using certain offensive epithets.
I remarked, my young friend, for God's sake, don't disturb this meeting. I saw that the feelings were strong and so determined that I called on some other white men to assist me in preserving the peace. No one responded. I saw Neal, Wharton, and Thompson draw their pistols, and I stepped up to Neal, telling him, this will not do. I did the same with Thompson, and they put their weapons back in their pockets. In a few minutes, though, they drew them out again. Then the shooting began. I saw Thompson shoot the first shot that was fired, pouring out some 4 or 5 shots into the crowd of which he formed a part. This time the firing became general. The colored people soon concentrated at this point. When the white liners dispersed and the firing ceased, soon, however, I heard shooting at the east end of the speaker's stand, which continued for some time. It seemed to be general. That is, in every direction of which I was. I saw 2 colored men wounded, one shot very seriously and the other was almost dead. I saw several other colored men who were wounded more or less. I have since learned of the deaths of Charles Chilton, Martin Sibley, Frank Thompson, White, and Alexander Wilson, Louis Hargrove, and the son of Samuel Anthony and another boy whose name is not known to me.
Well, amid the chaos and bloodshed of the riot, there were individual acts of heroism, black and white. Charles Chilton, a white Republican who lived near Moss Hill, was shot in the back by an unknown assailant while guiding black women and children to the safety of his front yard. Hubbard Strange, a black Republican who had lived in Raymond, knew of several whites from Raymond who were at Moss Hill that day.
After the shooting started, I saw Frank Thompson run out of the crowd and mount the wrong horse. Senator Caldwell called for him to stop with a motion of his hand. But Thompson paid no attention and rode off. I saw a colored man hit a young white man over the head with a tree limb. I told that man, I raised Jesse myself and not to hurt him. That man just turned away. I saw John Neal sitting, wounded on a wagon close by.
Uncle saved my life too.
I will. Come with me. So my son Levi helped me put Neal and Wharton in a buggy. Levi drove the buggy, and I followed behind, all the way to Mr. Neal's house.
Within 5 minutes after the start of the riot, most people had fled Moss Hill. Many of them went to the Clinton Depot to wait on the 4 o'clock train from Vicksburg on its way to Jackson. Now, while they boarded the train, a large number of armed whites left the train. These were the 40 white liners from Bolton and Edward Station, who had organized themselves hours before the riot started. Upon arrival in Clinton, these vigilantes sent scouts to Moss Hill to determine what had happened. Now, later that evening of September 4th, another group of white men from Vicksburg arrived at the Clinton Depot, calling themselves Modocs, after an Indian tribe in California noted for its vicious attacks on white settlers. These vigilantes began searching for black men. They went to Charles Caldwell's home and confronted his wife, Margaret Ann Caldwell, who was caring for 2 wounded men. Margaret Caldwell later testified,
"They said to me,
Tell your husband we gonna kill him.
If it's 2 years or 1 year or 6, no difference.
We gonna kill him anyhow.
They said they had orders to kill him because he belonged to the Republican Party and sticked up for those Negroes.
He has got to die.
The immediate death toll of the Clinton riot included 3 white men killed, probably 5 blacks, 2 of whom were children. Now, in the days and weeks that followed, after night riders finished their work, dozens of blacks lay dead, victims of a massacre. When Governor Adelbert Ames learned of the rioting in Clinton that Saturday afternoon, he sent telegrams to U.S. President Ulysses S. Grant and to the U.S. Attorney General requesting federal assistance to restore order. Well, President Grant's advisors warned him that further use of federal troops in the South could cost the Republican Party key states in the upcoming presidential election. So the national electorate had grown tired of troubles in the South, and radical Republicans no longer controlled the United States Congress. Sarah Dickey was concerned about President Grant's refusal and wrote him a letter after the riot.
September 25th, 1875. Dear President Grant, allow a humble woman to address your excellency in behalf of the poor, oppressed people, the colored people of the southern states, especially this state. Seeing as I do that thousands of them are just on the eve of being sacrificed by the hands of the assassin, I cannot hold my peace. I was at the Republican meeting held at Clinton on September 4th myself, was on the ground early, and I saw enough with my own eyes to convince any honest person that the Republicans went there for nothing but peace, profit, and pleasure. And the Democrats, who were there on the ground, went there for the express purpose of creating a disturbance and killing as many as they could. You hear a great deal about the massacre in Clinton, but you do not hear the worst. It cannot be told. Hoping God's blessing may attend these earnest thoughts, yours sincerely, Sarah Dickey.
When Mississippi experienced civil disorders in Yazoo County and other areas after the Clinton riot, Governor Ames sent 2 militia companies to secure militia weapons stored in Bolton and Edward Station. Now, Ames believed the Whiteliners would attempt to seize the militia weapons stored there, and Senator Charles Caldwell, the captain in the state militia, led one of the companies. Caldwell's role greatly angered Democrats, who accused the governor of trying to provoke a race war to disrupt the November elections. Both parties used the Clinton riot and furthered their efforts to win in November.
We put ads in the newspapers and had our preachers encourage their congregants to vote. We knew the Democrats would intimidate colored voters, stuff the ballot boxes. It was very discouraging to our people. And then President Grant made it clear after the Clinton riot that he would not send the United States Army to guarantee a fair election in Mississippi as he had done before. There was intimidation in Hinds County, but colored people voted in large numbers at the Clinton precinct. Judge Amos Johnson and I were elected to the 2 Senate seats representing Hinds and Rankin counties. Judge Johnson had the highest number of votes, but I outpolled him in the Clinton box. In spite of all our hard work and our best efforts, the Democrats won the state in November, taking control of the State House and the Senate with large majorities. I knew it would be difficult for my people when the legislature convened in January.
Well, Governor Ames, facing impeachment by the newly elected white Democratic legislature, resigned his office in March 1876 and left the state. After the 1876 presidential election, all federal troops were removed from the South. As cruel as fate had been to the hopes and political dreams of former slaves and their descendants, an even crueler blow would be dealt to Senator Charles Caldwell on Thursday, December 30th. He had gone fox hunting north of Clinton that day. His wife gave a detailed account of the events that led to Caldwell's murder that evening when she testified before the Balfour Committee.
The first trouble was an insult passed on his nephew, David Washington. So they picked a fuss, a white man, Waddy Rice, in a blacksmith shop in Clinton. My husband came home about 4 o'clock in the evening, and someone had told him about the fuss picked with his nephew, and he walked downtown to see about it. He was in town about a half hour and came back and ate his dinner. And just between dark and sundown, he goes back downtown again. I did not know what he was doing down there until after dusk. And a man, Madison Bell, a colored man, came and said,
Mrs. Caldwell, you had better go down and see about Mr. Caldwell. I think the white folks are going to kill him.
I did not go myself, but went to Professor Bell and asked him to go and get him. Mr. Bell went, and he never came back at all until he came back under arrest. I was in my room until just nearly dark. The moon was quite young, and the chapel bell rang. I knew the minute the bell rang what it all meant.
What it meant was, after the riot in September, townsmen and college faculty and students stored pistols and rifles in the basement of the college chapel to be used if and when there was civil unrest in the town.
The young men who lived across the street, when the bell tolled, they ran to the chapel and got their guns. There were 150 guns there. I went downtown, and then they all got ahead of me everywhere I went. And some of them wanted to know who I was, but I hid my face as well as I could. As I got to town, I went to go into Mr. Children's store, and every store was closed just that quickly. But it was early, just about 6 o'clock. Children was lit up by a big chandelier. And as I went over to the lumberyard, I saw a dead man. I stumbled over him. And as I looked at him, I did not know who he was. And I went into Children's, and as I put my feet up on the doorstep, standing as close, many a few feet, there was Judge Cabanas, a friend of my husband. And as I went to go in, they cursed me and threatened to hurt me. And the judge among the banners, but he didn't even know me. They all stood. Nobody would let me go in. They all stood there with their guns. I knew there were 2 dead men, but I did not think it was my husband at the time.
The dead man that Margaret had stumbled over was Sam Caldwell, Charles Caldwell's brother. Sam had come by Chilton's store on his way home from the fields. He was killed by the mob out of fear that he would arouse African Americans in the neighborhood to violence when they discovered Senator Caldwell had been murdered.
I stood right there, and they said to me,
You don't get out of here, we're gonna make it damn hot for you.
Damn hot for you.
Hot as hell.
Go home.
Well, I didn't say anything and walked off and walked right over the dead man. I stopped and tried to see who he was, but they were cursing and trying to get me out of town, to get out. I went on over to the house and went upstairs and back to my room and laid down, a widow. After nearly an hour, Parson Nelson came up, Preacher Nelson. He called 3 or 4 times.
Mrs. Caldwell? Mrs. Caldwell. Answer, Mrs. Caldwell. And don't be afraid, and nobody will hurt you.
What do you want?
Mrs. Caldwell, I've come to tell you some news, and it's sad news to you. Your husband, he's dead. He's been killed. And Sam, too.
After a length of time, Professor Hillman of the Institute brought the bodies to the room. Professor Hillman and Preacher Nelson carried them to the bedroom, both of them, and put them there, and seemed to have them laid out and fixed up. Preacher Nelson said in my presence,
"A braver life never had died than Charles Caldwell. I never seen a man die with a manlier spirit in his life."
Preacher Nelson told Margaret Caldwell that Buck Cable, a white man and former friend, took her husband to the cellar at Chilton's store for a drink. And Caldwell was looking for Waddy Rice, but Cable insisted, and the two sat at the table in the cellar.
when they touched their glasses and were talking, somebody shot right through the back front outside the gate window, and my husband fell to the floor. When he was first shot, he called for Judge Cabinets and for Mr. Chilton. They were all around, and nobody went to his relief, them men standing there with their gun. He called for Preacher Nelson. Nelson went to the cellar door, but was afraid to go in. Nelson called to him 2 or 3 times.
Don't shoot me. Don't shoot me.
And Charles said he wouldn't hurt him, and asked Preacher Nelson to take him out of the cellar, that he wanted to die in the open air.
I carried him to the middle of the street, and the men all shouted.
We'll deal with him while we got it.
Yeah, 'cause dead men tell no tale.
I asked them to let him see his wife, but they said
No!
He stood right there in the street while they riddled him with 30 or 40 of their load. They shot at him all that many times. These were the senator's last words.
Remember, when you kill me, you kill a gentleman and a brave man. Never say you killed a coward. I want you to remember it.
The Clinton riot signaled the beginning of the end of voting rights for African Americans in Mississippi, and exclusion of their voices from the political process that would last until after passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, 100 years later. The chapter of the Clinton riot in history, like many others in the struggle for civil rights, is written in blood. The events of the recent past show all too clearly that struggle remains unfinished. According to Harry Truman, the only thing new is the history you don't know. By knowing our history, we know ourselves. And by knowing ourselves, we hope we will be touched, as Abraham Lincoln said, by the better angels of our nature as we strive for decency, reconciliation, and hope. Here's the roll call of the known dead, the victims of the Clinton riot and its aftermath. There are undoubtedly others known but to God. Frank Thompson,
Martin Sisulu, Charles Lynn Chilton, William Alpha, Bob Beasley, Simon Jackson, Wade Walker, Calvin Johnson, Louis Hargreaves, Square Hodge, Dolph Stevens, Isaac Stevens, Galilee Brown, Daniel Dabney, Alfred Hastings,